Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where in the world you're joining me from. Me, Illuminati, this, the Crypto and Cognac podcast show, as always, live every Thursday evening, 7 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time. Same back place, same back channel, YouTube, right? And as always, if I'm here, any day, yeah. You know what I mean? Guys, it's Thursday evening, but thank God it's the end of the work week. This was a long ass short week. So we've made it, right? We've made it to the end of the week here in Trinidad and Tobago, at least, right? Because we have two holidays, Friday and Monday. So we have a long weekend. That's thing to celebrate. That's thing to celebrate. So I still haven't moved the pure white from at the studio desk, right? But we're not gonna do that today. We're gonna celebrate. We're gonna have a little bit of a better time. So today we're gonna bring out the X to the O, right? You all see the difference in the colors there? That's because of the extra time spent in those oak barrels aging for the XO. For those who don't, oh my gosh, for those who don't know, one of my favorite things, one of my favorite snacks to have, Caribbean snack, is a snow cone. So today I decided to have my Henny with some crushed ice. We're gonna make a little bit of a Henny snow cone, right? That's what we're doing today. Cheers to you and you and you. As always, thank you for being here with me. So good. But before we jump into it, before we start talking about what we're going to be talking about, house rules, some housekeeping. This is not a financial advisory podcast. I am not a financial advisor. So nothing that I share here today, nothing that anybody in the comments share, should be misconstrued as being financial advice. It's always about the ice rule, whether it's crushed ice or ice blocks or ice balls for the case for that matter, right? It's all about information, conversation, education, sometimes entertainment, and of course, remember, drink, drive, degen, all responsibly, right? Today, we are talking about Mr. Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, or the Fed, as they are most popularly known. You know, every week I wait and wait to see what I'm going to talk about on the podcast because crypto never sleeps. Something is always happening in crypto, and I like to be very much on the pulse of what is happening. And today, while waiting and thinking about a few things that I was going to talk about, I had the opportunity to take a look at um, Chairman Powell's interview. And I mean, maybe he's done other interviews previously, but I just maybe have not paid much attention to him or it. I'm not a huge fan of the Federal Reserve. I'm not a huge fan of his. But for the first time, I sat down and I looked at an interview, and I thought he was very candid. Maybe because he's on the tail end of his tenure, he was, almost relatable. You know what I mean? And for the first time, I heard him say one or two kind of positive things about crypto. And everything is happening right now in the space with him, with Trump and their back and forth war. And I said, you know what? Maybe today is a good time for us to kind of delve into Chairman Powell, um, and talk a little bit about some of the things that he talked about in that particular interview, which was done with the Economic Club. And it's interesting because Powell has been at the helm of the Fed now for just over 7 years. Usually they have a 4-year term. So he's on his way out next year. And I didn't really think about it until he mentioned it, or until the interviewer mentioned it, that he has been the head of the Federal Reserve through some of the most tumultuous times in our financial history. More so America's, but America sneeze, the whole Caribbean catch cold. So this guy has been in charge during the pandemic, right? The crazy dash for cash that happened in March 2020 because of the pandemic. The great inflation, the bank crisis last year. Was that last year or year before? Where Silicon Valley Bank went under and a couple other banks went under. And now he is facing this, trade war madness that, has been brought about by the actions of the current US administration, President Trump to be more specific. And, I was thinking, bro has not had an easy time, right? And not that I feel sorry for him, right? I don't like central banks generally in terms of how they operate. And I wouldn't say central banks. I like that central banks are responsible for regulating a country's economy. I just don't appreciate that most of the expertise that grows in the central banking, or that is groomed into the central banking operation or apparatus, come from the commercial banking sector, and they tend to be very biased towards their former employers, friends that they've left behind as it relates to the commercial banking sector. And I think they provide a little bit too much protectionism for the commercial banking sector, right? The Federal Reserve is very unique compared to most central banks in terms of the fact that they are a private institution. They are protected by legislation in the US, and they operate fairly different to some of the other central banks in the world. But like going back to it, I think in this interview particularly, I don't know, I just felt a little bit more empathy. I saw the human in Jerome Powell. That human might be an asshole, but I saw the human in him, right, in this particular conversation. And so I just decided, today we're going to talk a little bit about it. We're going to talk about some of the things that he talked about, talk about some of the points that he raised. And, he was just saying some interesting things, he compared the COVID-19 crash to, Dunkirk. I don't know if you guys familiar with Dunkirk, but Dunkirk was, the World War II evacuation where fishing boats were used to rescue stranded soldiers. Yeah, that Dunkirk, right? And basically what he was saying is that when the economy started spiraling in 2020, the Fed basically went all in towards stemming the tide. They used emergency rate cuts, they used massive bond buying, they were lending excessively to kind of backstop some of the corporations and even local governments. And basically they threw every single thing at COVID-19 to try to slow down what was happening in the economy. And I mean, to be fair to them, it kind of worked. Markets did calm down, banks continued to lend, and the economy did not collapse into a depression. And of course, we in the crypto space, after we eventually bounced back, we benefited a lot from some of that quantitative easing. We benefited from some of the liquidity in the market through one of the most significant periods of growth in the space, right? But coming out of all of that and extending into what is kind of happening today, we were stuck with a big white elephant in the room, inflation, right? And inflation is one of those things that impacts everyone. It impacts wallets of the average person all the way up. Some people have more disposable income and could afford to absorb a little bit more inflationary attacks, but inflation affects everyone, right? And he admitted that inflation has stayed, despite their rate cuts, has stayed much higher for much longer than the Fed expected. They have this 2% inflationary target in mind, and they are yet to quite get there. And he's basically said that the Fed isn't sitting on its hands, but in terms of rate cuts, as long as inflation remains above 2%, it just feels like the Fed has no choice but not to start cutting rates, right? He said they're not going to rush to cut rates because they think it is going to be the wrong decision. And obviously, we have historical evidence of cutting too fast, prices jumping, confidence takes a hit, and the economy as a whole suffers, right? So I don't want to say I feel sorry for him, but I understand that these guys are walking a tightrope between what needs to happen, what they are under pressure to have happen, what their responsibilities are. And I think some of what is happening now is gonna probably save them from having to really act on in terms of rate cuts, in terms of treating with inflation and all of that. Because what we're seeing right now is, well, what we have been seeing is that the jobs market has not been doing very well, right? But I mean, Chairman Powell, he seems optimistic. He thinks that unemployment is low, people are working, wages are up, and all that sounds good, yeah. But there's also, I guess, some rainy lines in the sunshine, because hospitality, travel, retail, and some of the other sectors still haven't bounced back. And I think with everything that we've seen happen, just from a social status as it relates to America since President Trump has taken office, I don't know that those things are going to be coming back and booming in the way that they would have hoped. He talked about the disparities between some groups like Blacks and Hispanic workers, still facing significantly higher unemployment, lower wage gains. But I think things are better overall. He talked about all this, the impact of this trade war and the pressures of politics and the independence of the Federal Reserve. I mean, President Trump has talked significantly about seeking to gain control of the Federal Reserve, and I think Powell kind of re-emphasized the importance of the Fed staying independent, them making decisions based on data. I don't know that they are independent. I think they're independent of the government. I don't know if they're independent of other forms of influence or other influential groups. But I think he thinks that it's important that they remain independent of the politics. And it sounds good, but there's always a conflict between Wall Street and Main Street, and the Fed has to be wary of this at all times. He reminded people that the Fed does not answer to the White House, does not answer to Congress, and they have a clear mandate to stabilize prices and to maximize employment. That is their mandate, and they're going to stick to it. Again, a lot of this challenge of power or measuring of parts is what has led to the consistent conflict between the Federal Reserve and Chairman Jerome Powell and President Trump. I mean, egos are flaring, and I think this is not new, because Trump and Powell have kind of always been in conflict with each other. Trump has been calling via his social media platforms, via X, even when it was Twitter, tweeting that Powell was clueless, and now he thinks that Powell should lose his job. He has been pressing for it. He has gone to the courts. He's probably going to try to go to Congress to try to relieve Chairman Powell of his position even sooner than next year. Because the fact is, Trump wants interest rates cut, and he wants them cut right now. And Chairman Powell isn't flinching. He in his mind, he has a role to play, and he's gonna carry that out in the way that he thinks is best suited. But I wanted to go through. There was a particular, not tweet, I don't even know what you call these comments on Truth Social, that Trump said today. He said the ECB is expected to cut interest rates, as the European Central Bank is expected to cut interest rates for the 7th time, and yet too late, which is what he calls Jerome Powell. Jerome Powell of the Fed, who is always too late and wrong in bold, yesterday issued a report which was another and typical complete mess, in inverted commas again, right? Oil prices are down, groceries, even eggs. If you're not on the inside joke about eggs and how expensive they are, listen, I don't know where you are in the world. But anyway, Trump in on it, right? He said groceries, even eggs, are down, and the USA is getting rich on tariffs. I don't know if the USA getting rich on tariffs. Or, well, the government might be getting rich on tariffs. I don't know if the people getting rich on tariffs. But too late should have lowered interest rates like the ECB long ago, but he should certainly lower them now. Powell's termination cannot come fast enough. That's what the man said. He said he cannot wait to see the back of Jerome Powell. And he is doing everything in his power to put pressure on Chairman Powell, but Powell refuses to cave under the political pressure, and he has consistently come back to saying the Fed is not a political tool. I don't know if they're not a political tool because they are appointed by the president. So we'll see who Trump gets in there next year, if he's unable to get Jerome Powell out beforehand. But I think while he's there and while he continues to not cut rates and go against what Trump thinks is the best thing, I mean, at this point, anybody who going in the other opposite direction to Trump might deserve a clap, right? I don't know, right? But I just say, but I don't know, for the period that he's here and continues to go in opposition to President Trump, I think we're going to see a lot more fireworks. I think we're going to see a lot more tweets or truths or whatever it is on Truth Social. But I was very intrigued to hear Chairman Powell who has traditionally not been fond of crypto for the most part. I mean, he's been very wary, to put it mildly. And he hasn't totally changed. He still warns about the volatility. He still thinks it's a scam to some extent. He still thinks there's systemic risk. And I mean, him and the Fed have even looked at CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. He thinks that he wants to see stable coins regulated. And he thinks there's a lot of noise in the space. But in that conversation yesterday, for the first time, he seemed to be cautiously optimistic that the industry was maturing to a stage where some responsible things are happening. He's still concerned about consumer protection around the space. But I think, like Jamie Dimon, in a couple of years, maybe when he leaves the pressures of the chairman's seat, we might hear a totally different tone from Chairman Powell. So for me, I think that is so representative of the continued transition in thought process around the crypto space, especially coming from the players in the traditional finance space. And I think, when we get to the point where we're converting these kind of guys, I think we're doing something good. And it's, part of the reason why I continue to say that adoption is inevitable. And when we look back to these moments, I think we're going to see them as pivotal moments in that whole adoption journey of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. So all that to say, as I started, it was interesting. It was interesting. For the first time I saw him as a man, I saw him as a human, I saw him as a person trying to do a job that might be, a harder job that I had previously contemplated, who had kind of hated because he seemed like a crypto hater. But it shows that there's duality in all things. And he was talking about looking forward to his retirement, about the things that he does in his spare time to recover from all the analysis and everything that's required for him on a day-to-day basis. He was very casual and comical about people's interpretation of what he does and what the Fed does in terms of flipping coins and that kind of thing. He was talking about going home and Zoom calling his kids and his grandkids and going to the gym, and you just realize, bro, I mean, he's an asshole, but he's a human. He's a human, you know what I mean? So yeah, Jerome Powell, I see the humanity in you, sir. I see the humanity in you. I hope you see humanity in yourself, and I hope that you make the right decisions for America's economy and ultimately for the world's economy and ultimately pump my bags now, my brother. But I think ultimately what it shows me is that he's not a guy who hastens to make decisions. So when we do eventually see those rate cuts, I don't think we're going to see a situation where, we see a rate cut this quarter and then they're back to raising rates next quarter. I think he's someone who is going to, kind of hold direction in whatever he's going to do for the next little bit. So whenever the pipe turns on, I think we could be confident that it's gonna stay on at least for a little bit, right? At least for a little bit, it's gonna stay on. So with that said, I'm still hopeful that there is a bull cycle to come in 2025, and of course, there is growth to take place in this crazy cryptic world of cryptocurrency. Right? We ain't going nowhere. We ain't going nowhere. We can't be stopped now. because it's crypto for life. Guys, a pleasure being with you as always. As I say every single week, adoption is inevitable. Illuminati. Stephen, big up yourself, my brother. Forget to hail you out. Big up Onika, George, Eddie, Stephen, Anil, Anom, Twaley, KM, everybody in the chat. Big up on yourselves. Right? Illuminati out. Be blessed. Cheers.